Okay, so 12 years ago, one of the greatest cult classics to ever hit cinema premiered in theaters on August 13th of 2010. Now, what is that movie, you might ask, and what makes it such a great cult classic? Well, it's Scott Pilgrim versus the World, and we're going to talk about what makes it so great on this particular episode. Hi everyone, I'm Bryce, and I want to take a deep dive into Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which is one of my greatest, most favorite movies of all time, way back, starting in 2010 when it debuted. I had only heard of the movie. I'd never watched it. I believe I was about 14 years old at the time, in middle school, and I watched it in 2020, and it turned into one of my favorite movies of all time. So I'm going to celebrate its 12th anniversary by taking a deep dive into the movie and talking about all the juicy details of it, all the way from my favorite scenes, the least favorite scenes, what makes it so great, what makes it not so great in some aspects, the soundtrack. We're going to cover it all here in this 12th anniversary Scott Pilgrim movie discussion extravaganza. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with a quick synopsis of Scott Pilgrim. And I have prepared this synopsis for you, and I'm going to read it off just so I don't get it wrong. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a 2010 romantic action comedy film taking place in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. It's the story of Scott Pilgrim, a young lost bass guitarist in between jobs going through his early 20s. In a stunning turn of events, he meets a girl who is literally the woman of his dreams, who is Ramona Flowers. However, her love comes with a catch. He must defeat her 7 evil exes in order for them to continue to date. So this movie, one of the most beautiful parts about it is the fact that its synopsis seems so outrageous, so outlandish, and it's part of what to me makes it so special. Now, how did I discover this movie for the very first time? Well, in 2020, as a lot of you might be watching or listening know, that we hit the COVID-19 pandemic, and at that time, a ton of table reads were being conducted amongst friends, cast members for movies, all kinds of weird groups. And for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the entire cast and director Edgar Wright decided to come together and shoot a table read on YouTube for said movie. I ran into it one day on YouTube. I pretty much listened to the entire thing, and then I thought to myself, I see this movie's on Netflix, why don't I go ahead and watch it? And after that, I pretty much fell in love from everything between the characters, the soundtrack, especially Ramona Flowers. I had a huge crush on Mary Elizabeth Winstead for months after this movie. I have now been sucked into everything wonderful about this film. I have heard other people celebrate its 10th anniversary, its 11th anniversary. Now I want to step in and do my own version for the 12th anniversary. And for those of you who are curious as to what that table read all entailed and what it looked like, I'm going to go ahead and link it down in the description below so you can take a look for yourself at the masterpiece that is that table read. Okay, so the first thing I want to dive into is really what makes Scott Pilgrim vs. the World so wonderful. There are quite a few different items to go through in this list, including the wardrobe of the cast, the awesome stylistic humor, the soundtrack, the character growth, the imaginativeness, and the creativeness that director Edgar Wright employs. There's so much beauty in this film to be had. And starting with the humor of this movie, I think that this movie is absolutely one-liners galore. There are so many quotable moments in the film between just about every single character. In fact, I've got a whole segment dedicated to the best one-liners in the entire movie. Another thing that makes this movie so funny is the fact that all the characters are kind of slightly mean and douchey to each other. For example, you've got Stacy Pilgrim, Scott's sister. She's really mean to him. You've got Wallace, his roommate, who's kind of a douche to him. You've got Julie Powers, who is crushed by Aubrey Plaza in one of her debuts, also being a dick to Scott. All of it is just really funny. And even a lot of the small details and set pieces all come together in order to make for a really funny experience. One of them that comes to mind is the scene where Scott is facing off against Roxy for the first time in the alley, and he basically tells her to go away. He immediately runs to a payphone to call his sister Stacy while she's working at the coffee shop, and he asks her, "Hey, I'm having a meltdown right now. Are you working?" And then she goes, "I'm literally about to leave." And he goes, "Cool, I'm coming in." And the camera kind of pans out just a little bit, and we can see that Scott is just calling right outside of the coffee shop. Like literally, if he turned around, he could see for himself that Stacy was in fact working. I thought that was a really funny, punchy detail that it's so in line with Edgar Wright's humor, and I just absolutely loved it. And additionally, when they are going through Lucas Lee's commercials and Lucas Lee's performance performance is absolutely crushed by Chris Evans. I thought he was electric in this film. They're filming a preview of a movie of his, and one of the lines he says in the film is along the lines of, "Listen here, bucko, the next 2 clicks you're gonna hear are first me hanging up the phone, and the second one is pulling the trigger." And Van from the Big Picture podcast pointed this out, and this didn't even occur to me till he said this. When you shoot a gun and you hear a clicking sound, it means the gun is empty. So he'd effectively be shooting an empty gun at whoever he's threatening. So I thought that was really funny too. And to top it all off, in the very first fight scene that Scott has against Romo's first evil ex-boyfriend, which is Matthew Patel, in the middle of the fight, Wallace just kind of breaks out there and he says, "Hey, what's up with that guy's outfit?" And another guy just chimes in. He's like, yeah, is he a pirate? And then they all just kind of attack this dude's outfit out of thin air in the middle while they're fighting. It's just so on the nose of this movie. And it's moments like that that really combine to make the humor and tone of this film special. It's so subtle, it's really effective, and it's not too much in your face or over the top. And there's just so many moments like that to absolutely love and chew off of. And now kind of transcending into the imaginativity and the creativity of the film, one thing that I really appreciate is the on-screen text edits that you see a lot of times. The example that comes to mind is at the very beginning and also kind of in that first scene at the Rocket Amphitheater where Scott is kind of just staring off into space. He's looking at Ramona and Knives who are sitting next to each other, and Steven is freaking out and he's kind of yelling, but you can't really hear him. So there's on-screen text that says, "Oh my God, Scott, would you look at me? You're freaking me out." I think edits like that, and also those from The Voice at the very beginning talking about the story of Toronto, Canada, how Scott is in there and he's dating a high schooler. I think those on-screen edits were way ahead of their time, and they are really subtle and effective in a world now like with TikTok, with Instagram Reels, where having subtitles on just about everything is super common. I think that this was a stylistic choice that, one, really worked well in the movie, and two, totally fits in with the times as of 2022. I doubt that that's what Edgar Wright had intended in doing so to fit in with the times today, but even so, I gotta give the man a lot of props for being 12 years ahead of the game, because that's just impressive. And it's something that you never really saw done in movies and continue not to see in movies, so it's very unique and adds that bit of flavor to the film. And I also really enjoyed the tying in of different video game animations with Scott's different milestones throughout the movie. Like, for example, every time that you saw him defeat an evil X, his score and the amount of points he would get would actually go up by 1,000. Like with Matthew Patel, he got 1,000. With Lucas Lee, it was 2,000. And then when you get all the way up to the Kadianagi twins, it was 5,000 and 6,000. And then finally with Gideon, it got up to 7,000 points. And then you even see him get up a life against the Kadianagi twins, which all of that together, it just, again, it's that unique imaginative style of the movie that you really haven't seen all that much. I mean, the most recent version of that I can think of that touches Scott Pilgrim is Free Guy with Ryan Reynolds, which is another great movie if you're looking for something else to add into the mix. And additionally, the transitions that this movie had were absolutely superb because, one, they were not only comical, but two, they actually showed Scott's state of mind and how he's progressing as a character. For example, when Scott is with Knives at the library and he sees Ramona in person for the very first time, they're sitting there in the library, and then all of a sudden it immediately cuts to him and the rest of his bandmates at practice, and then he's like, "Whoa, what's happening?" And then he says, and then Steven still says, "You only played one note the entire song." Before you know it, you're cutting again to hours later when they're going to a party. It shows a few things about Scott, and for one, it shows how enamored he was with Ramona because everything else just kind of blackens out to the rest of the world. That's all he can think about is Ramona. And just those three transitions, he completely forgets that Knives is even there. He's with her at the library. He forgets all about her presence, that even though she's staying right next to him, she's sitting on the couch at band practice. He doesn't even realize that she's there. And it also shows that he doesn't really care much about his involvement with the band, which to me is so sensical within the context of the movie that Neil ends up being the main bass guitarist for Sex Bomb, because it's clearly evident through some of these transitions and other moments throughout the movie that Scott really just doesn't care about the band that much at all. So it's appropriate that Neil takes over in his place, which to me wrapped up the ending of the film actually pretty nicely. And now I want to touch upon one of the biggest gems of the film by far, which is the soundtrack. What's beautiful about the soundtrack, it probably consists of a lot of acts that you've never even heard of. And the musical style actually within Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is really unique because because it's not really done by one single composer. What Edgar Wright and Michael Bacall did was essentially reach out to all these different musical acts to go ahead and write songs specifically for the movie that then they could portray and play in their own venues, thus making it all sound like very authentic music rather than just music made for a movie. And for me, it opened my eyes to this whole new world of artists that I had never heard of, like Metric, Frank Black, Beck, who's a Canadian artist, and who also played the music behind Sex Bomb. And what's even crazier about Beck is the fact that him and a friend of his made the entire sound and soundtrack of Sex Bomb and all their music in his garage in like a day. It was just him and one other guy, and they just totally fleshed it out with lyrics and everything. And I want to touch on the wardrobe for a second because it's a really subtle piece of the movie that I think adds a lot to it, and that's within actually Scott's different shirts that he has. If you'll notice throughout the film, he pretty much wears the same style of shirt. It's a t-shirt with very few words on it. He might have Zero, he might have Plum Tree, which, hey, fun fact, Plum Tree is actually one of the artists of one of the songs on the soundtrack, which is ironically called Scott Pilgrim. They're a Canadian-based band. But I just love how the shirts kind of subtly convey where Scott is at different points in the movie. In fact, Edgar Wright points out that in his fight with Todd, that Scott has a shirt that says 0 on it, and it shows that he's just kind of not quite all the way there. He's got 0 lives, which totally adds up because he doesn't get that additional life until after the Caddy and Nagi twins fight. It's just a small detail I really enjoyed about the film. It doesn't make or break it, but it's one of those subtle things that you can really appreciate. And I also really love the idea of the fact that they change up the look of Knives and Ramona actually pretty often throughout the movie. I'm not sure why they did it, but I thought it really worked. I don't know if it was the showcase that they're impulsive. I don't know if it was the showcase their angst, their upsetness or whatever, but to me, just really, really worked. And additionally, although I will admit that it is a little bit flawed, I actually really enjoyed the character growth of Scott by the time that the movie does end, mainly for the idea of second chances. I think people are very deserving of second chances, and although Scott doesn't get everything right the first time around, he does end up learning his lessons and growing as a human being and being a better person for it by the time the movie ends, because leading up to the very end, Scott's not really a great human. Like, he's really careless, he's really reckless, he doesn't really care who he hurts. He hurts a lot of people, he's hurt a lot of people in his past, and I think this film is really that journey of him finally learning to really grow up a little bit and to understand what it fully means to be a great partner, which is a great lesson for really anybody to take away. All right, so now getting into a little bit more of the fun stuff, I want to talk about my favorite character for the entire film, which to me is Wallace Wells, who's played by Kieran Culkin. Now, first off, I want to say that Kieran Culkin absolutely crushes his role as Wallace in this movie. He's deeply sarcastic, he's deeply confident, he's raw, he's funny, and he is real with Scott 100% of the time and says everything that the guy needs to hear, not necessarily what he wants to hear. He keeps it a buck with him at all times, and it really makes for some hilarious moments. But with that brashness, Wallace is also coming to Scott's aid at several points throughout the movie, which really makes it so beautiful. He's like that older brother. He will torture you at every chance that he gets, but when it comes to having your back, he will have it no matter what. For example, when Scott is going through this conundrum of juggling Knives and dating Ramona at the same time, Wallace kind of has this ultimatum saying, hey, you've got to break up with Knives. You can't break both of their hearts and cheat on them. It's not right. But at the same token, when Scott gets into some shit with Matthew Patel at the Battle of the Bands, he comes to his aid and also kind of helps ease the tension with his joke about Matthew Patel's outfit there. And additionally, he even talks smack to the opposing bands that they have in the Battle of the Bands by kind of heckling them from the crowd, saying, it's not a race, guys, or saying things like, is that girl a boy too? Like, just really subtle things that just show he's got Scott's back, but he's also not afraid to really push Scott to be his best. And I would even argue, even when he's telling Scott to move out, that's part of him telling Scott, hey, you gotta grow and evolve as a person. You can't just stay this lackadaisical human forever. And overall, Wallace is the character that Scott doesn't deserve because Scott is invariably a dick, but he's the one that he needed, and Kieran Culkin played that role so well, and for those reasons, I absolutely loved Wallace Wells. Although I do want to give an honorable mention to Ramona, who's played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead. Part of the reason why I fell in love with this movie initially is because I had a huge crush on Ramona Flowers and Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and honestly, it's for reasons that I can't quite quite put into words. It's like, why do you fall in love with things? Why do you love the things you do? You just kind of do. Which will lead me into my next favorite thing about Scott Pilgrim versus the World. I want to dive into my favorite scene, which is the Battle of the Bands at the Rocket venue. To me, this is the most representative scene of the entire movie. This is where you have the most characters residing in one place. You've got a lot of the great humor, you got a lot of the great transitions and imaginativeness and creativity that I talked about earlier. You've got the clashing of Knives and Ramona in the same room for the first time, and Scott shitting his pants, not knowing what to do. And then you get his first fight with his first evil ex, and also him trying to juggle everything with this band. It's just this huge mess of conglomeration, and it is just the most wholesome 3-4 minutes of the entire film. Also manages to showcase the soundtrack of the film within there, between a couple of the songs from Beck as Sex Bomb, a couple of the songs from the opposing band, including the song called We Hate You Please Die, which is only like 10 seconds long. It's awesome. It's a banger. And I think that the introduction of Matthew Patel really sets the tone for the remainder of the movie and really shows you what you're quite in for. Like, this whole scene just kind of tells the audience that, hey, you've arrived to this experience, so strap in because you're in for a wild, wacky, and awesome time. And boy, did this movie keep that promise. And I think out of all the characters, to sum up how the audience was probably feeling during the scene, is actually Stacey Pilgrim, played by Anna Kendrick. In fact, if you cut to her face in the scene, she at multiple moments audibly says out loud, "What?" Like just extremely confused when Matthew Patel starts dancing and having his musical number. She is just so dumbfounded. I think all of us were at that point, because this movie, it's something, man. And the last thing I'll say about the scene is the fact that it again shows that Scott is prioritizing his love life over the best interest of his band. When the opposing band is playing, Scott is again looking at Knives and Ramona, not paying any attention to Steven and how bad he's freaking out. Every time Steven begs this dude to put aside his outwardly romances for the sake of the band, Scott just won't do it. And again, showing Scott does not care about the band and shouldn't be in it. My rant is over. All right, so let's jump in next into what is my favorite evil ex in the film. I gave it a lot of thought, and it was a toss-up between Lucas Lee and also Todd. I had to give it, though, to Lucas Lee, played by Chris Evans. Lucas Lee reminds me of the jerky older brother who just loves to mess with their younger siblings. They exert power over you physically and mentally. They psych you out whenever they want to, and they can be really egotistically douchey at times. The best example I can think of by far is when Lucas is going to leave his hand out for Scott while he's on the ground after he says, "Oh, hey, you don't know about the league? Well, don't worry about it," and then just whacks him in the face. That is the epitome of older brother syndrome right there, just being a total ass. And Chris Evans has so much fun with it and makes the role of Lucas Lee so wholesome. And I think what really elevates Lucas Lee is that he's a really believable ex. This movie claims that he is a movie star, he's a really handsome guy, he's a really successful guy, and the movie really gets you to buy into that. You can totally see that he's someone who Ramona would date and go after, and it just really made the experience a lot more believable for me. You can just buy into the fact that the guy is desirable. And I gotta say, out of all the actors who are showing that they're having the most fun in this film, I think that Chris Evans is only second to Kieran Culkin in that regard, because he's so crass, aggressive, and just outlandishly arrogant that it totally works within being an evil ex for this movie. And actually, a fun fact for you guys, the line where Wallace hands Lucas Lee the skateboard and he says, "Hi there, big fan," and then Lucas Lee replies with, "Why wouldn't you be?" That actually happened to Edgar Wright with a musical act that he met once. I can't remember which musical act it was, but he revealed in an interview that when he once met one of his favorite musical acts, he said, "Hi there, I'm a big fan, nice to meet you," and the guy said, "Why wouldn't you be?" So the fact that that was kind of inspiration for the movie is also kind of a cool Easter egg from Edgar's life. Plus, what I love about Scott's interaction with Lucas Lee, and what made for one of the more memorable moments for me, is it shows a little bit more of Scott's growth, because he's got to outsmart Lucas in order to defeat him. Lucas Lee shows effectively that he will overpower Scott at every turn. Scott cannot defeat him with his fists, so Scott's got to try a different tactic that he hasn't considered before, which is using his brains in order to win, which he does successfully, and it shows how much he grows. We can see that continue when Scott has to defeat Todd because Todd is overpowering him, so he's got to outsmart him by making him drink the vegan soy milk or whatever milk it was that made the vegan police come and get him. And now, as much as I absolutely love and adore this movie, and the fact that it is in my top 2 favorite movies of all time, aside from The Perks of Being a Wallflower, I have to acknowledge that not everything in this movie is perfect, so I want to talk about its flaws for a second. First, I want to talk about perhaps my least favorite character of the film, which might surprise a lot of you. It's actually Gideon Graves, or G-Man. For whatever reason that I cannot quite put my finger on, I just didn't think that Gideon Graves worked for me on a very high level. I want to be clear here, it's not Jason Schwartzman's performance, because I thought he absolutely crushed it as Gideon Graves. He was really funny, he had some of the best one-liners in the entire film. He plays this very arrogant dick that is just so convincing. It's just, to me, Gideon as a character just wasn't capable of being a leader for all these evil exes, organizing the guild, and also being capable of mind controlling Ramona. I just didn't quite buy into that. I bought into the fact that he was desirable as a music executive. He's got a lot of money, he's wealthy, he's in charge of a lot of different bands, and he's a jerk. But as him being this powerful, charismatic guy, I just didn't quite land for me. And for those reasons, I thought he was my least favorite character. And it's kind of tough because if you ask me this question tomorrow, what my least favorite character is in this movie, I kind of go back and forth on it sometimes. Is it him? Is it the Katayanagi twins? I think the Katayanagi twins, they don't really have any dialogue in the movie, so it's really hard to say that they're even characters. So unfortunately, I kind of have to just relegate it to Gideon Graves as being my least favorite character, which is actually a great segue into my least favorite scene, and I'm actually going to combine it with my least favorite pair of evil exes. And if you just didn't guess by the kind of subtle hint that I just gave, my least favorite scene and my least favorite evil exes are the Katayanagi twins and the whole second round of the Battle of Bands between them and Sex Bomb. And what really makes this particular point interesting is the fact that Edgar Wright in an interview said that when it came to shooting, the shooting was over 100 days, which is the longest shoot that he's ever had of his entire career. But they would shoot like 6 days a week. And he said that when they were on set to film the scene with the Katayanagi twins, that they were just all exhausted at this point. And it's not to say that they didn't put their all into this movie, but when you're tired and burnt out like that, and the entire cast and crew and tired or burnt out at that point, it's no surprise that maybe the scene didn't come out as great as they wanted it to be. And when you combine that with the fact that the Katayanagi twins have no dialogue at all in the movie, it really robs you the opportunity to really understand them as characters, understand the relationship between them and Ramona. In fact, if I'm recalling correctly, I don't even think Scott Pilgrim versus the World as in the movie as a whole really outlines the relationship that Ramona had with them, other than the fact that she dated both of them at the same time. So really, as an audience member, there's really no reason to care about the Katayanagi twins other than if you're rooting for Sex Bomb to beat them in the Battle of the Bands. But considering Scott's still kind of a jerk, you're not really even caring so much about that because he doesn't even care about his own band. So at the end of the day, the scene with the Katayanagi twins, between them having no dialogue and there really being no stakes in the movie at this point, it just really made for an underwhelming scene that I just liked the least by far of the entire movie. Like, there's really no other scene other than actually the fight scene with Gideon after the montage that he has after Scott dies for the first time that I like less. It's just this one sticks out like a sore thumb to me and just really didn't work. Okay, so now with all of my favorite and least favorite things done with this movie out of the way, I want to give you some fun facts about Scott Pilgrim versus the World that you might not have heard otherwise. Okay, so Aubrey Plaza plays as Julie Powers in this movie. She's the girl who swears a lot at Scott, and when she does swear, the movie does like the whole blurring out of her mouth thing, and the movie actually acknowledges, wait, how are you doing that with your mouth? And she's never fucking mind how I'm doing it with my mouth, which again adds into the really awesome humor that this movie has. But I digress. When Edgar Wright cast Aubrey Plaza in this movie, this was actually one of her first bookings. Like, she had done no other big jobs in Hollywood up until this point, and it's actually during the shooting of this film that she got like 3 or 4 other jobs, including her role on Parks and Recreation. As Edgar Wright puts it in his interview, it's as if getting one job gets you 3 or 4 other jobs, and those get you more jobs. It's just really cool to hear how this was Aubrey Plaza's first big break, and she was so funny in this movie. Another fun fact for you that I've already kind of covered, but according to Edgar Wright, this film took 100 days to shoot, which is the longest of his career, and it oftentimes consisted of 6 days a week, with on Saturday they would mostly shoot musical numbers. And fun fact number 3, the scene where Scott sees Ramona delivering his package to his apartment and he takes it and he throws it into their garbage can, well, that was actually done for real. That was not edited to show Scott making it into the basket. They ended up retaking that exact shot, I believe, over 30 times in order for Michael Cera to actually throw it over his shoulder and make it into the waste bucket. They didn't want to edit it. They wanted it to be purely raw, purely real, and they ended up pulling it off after many, many tries. Another fun fact, Brie Larson at the time of filming this movie was about 19 years old, and before she became big as an actress, as you know her as Captain Marvel, or really before she even started acting in Scott Pilgrim versus the World, she was actually a pop singer, which makes a ton of sense, right? Because she sings the metric performance of Black Sheep in this movie, and by my opinion, it's actually really, really good, and I love that version of it. But now she's gone on to become a Marvel world famous actress, and she's quite good at what she does. Another fun fact for you, the voice that you actually hear narrating narrating at various points throughout the movie, including the very beginning narration, the Scott leveling up and gaining lives throughout the movie, that's actually voiced by Bill Hader. He is the very last credited cast member in the movie if you watch the credits close enough, and I thought that was a really cool Easter egg. And I didn't even notice it up until I rewatched this movie like last week. Another fun fact, everybody who is playing an instrument in this movie mostly learned to play it for the very first time while shooting for Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, with the exception of Michael Cera, who is actually a pretty experienced bassist going into shooting. Mark Webber, who plays Steven Stills, and Allison Pine, who plays as Kim, had to learn the drums and the guitar on their own, while Scott was already fresh in his mind. And the fact that these actors are able to be so talented to the point that they have to learn their lines, do all these crazy things, and learn an instrument at the same time is just absolutely bonkers. And as the fun facts keep rolling, did you know that Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is actually based off of a comic book series created by Canadian writer and artist Brian Lee O'Malley? He created Scott Pilgrim vs. the World as a graphic novel that was adapted into the screenplay that was written by Edgar Wright and fellow writer Michael Bacall. And if memory serves me right, I believe only 2 out of the 6 books were written by the time they started shooting filming. And taking that point about Brian Lee O'Malley even further, Brian Lee O'Malley's original idea for the 7 evil exes actually came from an experience he had with his spouse. Apparently, he learned one time that his spouse had 3 exes named Matthew, so he adapted the 3 evil Matthews to be the 7 evil exes. Talk about getting inspiration in your art. That is one heck of a wild one. 3 exes named Matthew. Now, I wouldn't be remiss if I didn't talk about some of the best one-liners and quotes from the entire movie, because there's quite a few of them. So I'm going to give you my top 5 in this case. Really in no particular order, just because they're all hilarious. One of my favorite ones comes from Scott, which he says, "Bread makes you fat," when him and Ramona are having a date at his apartment. When he's sitting there, he's like, "Oh yeah, I could eat bread all day." And then she goes, No, you'd get fat if you did that." And he goes, "Why would I get fat?" She goes, "Bread makes you fat." And he goes, "Bread makes you fat?" I just thought that was really funny. And additionally, this other one comes from Roxy, surprisingly, when she is about to bring down an axe kick down to Scott, and she in slow motion says, "Your BF is about to get effed in the B." I distinctly remember before the first time I watched this movie that a friend of mine and I were seeing it on screen somewhere in passing. He heard this line and he laughed really hard, and I've never forgotten the line since, and this was 6-7 years earlier when it first came out. Another one I love comes from Jason Schwartzman, where he goes, "The acoustics in here are amazing," which goes down right before him and Scott's final fight in the Chaos Theater. And of course, there's another one that I already mentioned earlier that comes from Lucas Lee, where he goes, "Now listen here, bucko. The next 2 clicks you hear are going to be 1 hanging up the phone and 2 pulling the trigger." Of course, I know I don't have that line exactly right, but you guys know exactly which one I'm referring to. This last one comes from Ramona, where Gideon says, "That's my girl," and then she goes, "Let's both be girls," and knees him in the nuts. That's another brilliant quote for me in this film. And an honorable mention is actually going to be coming from Brie Larson, where she says basically, "Being vegan makes you better than everybody else." There's so many one-liners that I'm probably forgetting in this movie, so bear with me, but if you've got a favorite one-liner, jump down in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And additionally, I actually really enjoyed the arc between Scott and Envy Adams, and the fact that he was so traumatized by his relationship with her, and then the movie kind of plays into that with his hat at all times, again adding to the comedy fuel of the film. Every time any girl says that his hair is getting shaggy, the scene instantly makes a jump cut to him from not having his hat on to him having his hat on. I thought that was just really funny. And now finally, to close off this 12th anniversary celebration of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, first I want to say thank you to all, but first I want to contemplate this idea of a Scott Pilgrim vs. the World sequel and whether or not I would want to see that. And to wrap up this episode of the Scott Pilgrim 12th anniversary celebration, I would like to discuss the whole idea of the likelihood of a sequel, and actually whether or not I'd really want to see said sequel. Given the climate of movies today, I think it would be extremely lowly likely for this movie to ever get a sequel, and honestly, I wouldn't even want to see a sequel. Talking more so on the greenlit piece of this, I think that with the amount of money that Scott Pilgrim actually lost back in 2010, for those of you who don't know, Scott Pilgrim had a budget of $60 million and it made $48 million worldwide. The fact that it lost money in 2010 when comic book movies maybe weren't so mainstream and it was more of a cult classic, I don't think it would stand to make really that much money in today's climate. Audiences are very select about what they go and see, and to see this kind of off, very cult classic-ish movie come back to theaters, I don't think would make for a lot of box office attraction. And more so going on to my particular taste, which is I just wouldn't want to see a sequel, is the fact that I'm not sure where the story would go from here. Scott, he grows as a character, he wins the girl, he defeats the evil exes. It's like, where do you really stand aside from that? The only interesting ammo I can think of would be a spin-off of this film where we kind of get more of a look at Knives as a character and how really her experience with Scott traumatized her and what she does going forward with that. I think there's a little bit of ammo to be had there, but not really a whole lot. So between the fact that it lost money in theaters, that audiences are a little bit more selective in what they choose to watch today, and you don't really know where the story goes from here, I for one wouldn't really want to see a sequel to this movie. I'd prefer for them to just keep it and leave it alone as is, and it will always be one of my favorite movies of all time. And that, my friends, will bring us to the very end of this celebration of Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Thank you so much for watching. If you're still here, I absolutely love you for that. Do you love Scott Pilgrim? Have you not heard of the movie until this particular episode for the first time? Whatever your thoughts are about this movie, I would be honored and love to hear them down in the comments below. And thank you again so much for joining me. Look forward to more videos soon. If you want to check more out, see these end cards of the links down below. I've been Bryce, and until next time, have a great day.